It was like hearing two lost tapes playing on the same player, two identical voices occupying the same time and the same space. I was in the living room, thinking about nothing in particular, the radio off, warm air coming through the half-open window, and yet a simple, everyday phenomenon tore the surface of my routine like a loose thread on clothing. My mother and my stepfather were talking in the kitchen, a room separated from the living room by two walls, almost a hallway of shadows and tiles, and I understood every syllable. The kettle clicking, a spoon clinking in a glass, the measured breathing of someone speaking from habit. My stepfather's voice came naturally, talking about the roadside bar, as if pressing a memory's button. While that narration continued, another voice, identical, with no different timbre or hesitation, shouted, "Nina, look, it's Mom." This second voice seemed ripped from the same vocal tube, and yet came on top of the first, like a duplicate shadow projected at the exact same moment. It took my brain a full second to realize something was wrong. I got up from where I was, my heart beat loud enough that I could hear the blood in my temples. I opened the kitchen slowly, expecting to find someone laughing at me, or a bizarre echo coming through the window. They were there. My mother, a cup warming in her hands, him with a distracted look, as if he hadn't just split his own speech in two. "What the hell was that?" I blurted out without planning it. No one answered. They didn't know what I was talking about. Even now, when I close my eyes, I try to reconstruct that moment like someone trying to reassemble a broken clock. Pieces that fit, sound that disappears, and a permanent feeling that something small, almost domestic, was, for a second, wrong with the world.
I need to tell something that still bothers me when I think about what's real and what's just everyday noise. The story starts like so many others. A warm afternoon in a room with curtains half open, the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, and the comfortable sound of familiar voices. But between familiarity and calm, there was a cut, a tiny crack that left a huge doubt. I want you to follow this with me, paying attention to the details, because that's where the strangeness lives. Before I continue, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming stories. Here, every account is investigated without sensationalism. Like the video if you enjoy the tone, and share it to help tell this mystery. Oh, and leave in the comments which country and city you're watching from. It's fascinating to see where our everyday paranoias echo around the world. I write and narrate in first person to keep the sense of closeness. You will smell the places, see the movements, and feel where my reasoning tripped. I promise not to invent plot twists just to shock. Everything here is worked to sound possible, almost mundane, until something forces us to look again. If you've gone through something similar, tell us. If not, pay attention to the small noises in your house this week. Let's go on. I'll describe the space, the gestures, and the instant when the reality I knew shrank a little.
My memory tends to catalog spaces by sound. The old apartment where this happened had a particular acoustics, two walls between the kitchen and the living room that created a corridor of reverberations. It was a place of surfaces that kept conversations. Tiles, cold floor, the wood of the table, everything returning phrases with micro delays if you knew how to listen. That day, when everything changed, the living room was arranged as always. A worn armchair on one side, a bookshelf leaned against the wall, a floor lamp with a yellowed shade. Sunlight slipped through cracks and scored the rug. My two dogs, Nina, my stepfather's, black and adult, and another smaller one that always hovered around our feet, lay curled up without hurry. The clock read some ordinary hour of the afternoon. My mother asked for coffee, with that voice that mixes habit and politeness. "Want some coffee?" She said it in a tone that didn't expect a dramatic answer, just a polite habit. My stepfather started talking about the roadside bar, a place with wooden tables, yellow lights, and cheap beer. He spoke with the cadence of someone replaying the scene. I was paying attention to the images his words painted. The voices, at first, fit together as they always did, a call and response of people who live in the same house. The dog, Nina, used to his affectionate tone, wagged her tail. I read the room like one reads a familiar book, and that's why the break felt like a fissure. Predictability leaves less room for ruptures. The second voice arrived at the same instant the first was still unfolding. It wasn't a weak echo or an imitation, it was exactly the same timbre. It shouted, "Nina! Look, it's Mom!" with the same inflection, but with a note of surprise that didn't match the previous topic. The sound occupied a space that was already filled by the memory of what had been said about the bar. In the space of a blink, I felt language collide, as if two parallel lines had been forced to cross. There was a knot in my stomach that couldn't tell whether it was fear or confusion. The house suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to hold not only voices, but a perceptual error that refused to be explained. I walked into the kitchen with measured steps. Everything there was material for verification. The boiling kettle, the glasses, a towel hanging. I asked out loud, as if confirming whether I was speaking to strangers. What was that? Who called Nina? They looked at me as if surprised by a trivial question. My words fell flat without creating an echo. My mother frowned. My stepfather looked puzzled. "What are you talking about?" he asked, wiping the rim of his cup with his hand. Normality returned quickly, as if the room had swallowed the noise and given back silence. I stood in the threshold, torn between laughing nervously and insisting on an explanation that seemed impossible to articulate. I spent the afternoon replaying the moment in my head, trying to trace any external source, noise from the street, a forgotten television, a neighbor with a loud radio. Nothing. The apartment was the kind that kept its resonances. That's when the idea that I might be going paranoid started whispering, and paranoia is a neat kind of explanation. Before sleeping, I went over every gesture I'd seen. Nina's tail wag, the movement of a spoon, the position of the curtains. Everything matched my recollection except for the central event. Two identical voices sharing the same moment. There remained an uncomfortable feeling that a layer of routine was inaccessible to me, like a document with a torn page.
In the days that followed, I treated the episode like a technical glitch. I reordered memories, looked for witnesses, and tested possibilities. I talked to friends, described the sequence, and listened to suggestions. Some laughed, others mentioned lapses in attention. No one offered an explanation that held up under the weight of detail. It seemed impossible that two identical voices had said different things at the exact same second. I told my mother calmly, hoping that repeating the story would bring clarity. She looked at me and touched my shoulder gently, a gesture meant to soothe. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said. My stepfather, for his part, frowned and, after a moment, talked about the bar again, as if reaffirming the memory would cure the discomfort. I etched the phrasing into my head, the emphasis on rodovia, the short laugh at the end. The second utterance, calling Nina, carried something urgent and childlike, like a man play-acting as a kid. That difference in register disturbed me the most, the coexistence of a mundane account with an intimate shout. I began searching for patterns in other small occurrences. Phones ringing with two calls at once, voices on the street that seemed to overlap. Nothing as blatant as that first moment. When I told a coworker, she pulled back a bit and mentioned vivid dreams. "Maybe you were half asleep," she suggested, with the light condescension of someone trying not to alarm you. I reviewed the apartment's floor plan carefully. The two walls between the kitchen and living room form an angle that creates small resonance chambers. I thought about acoustic phenomena, diffraction, reflection, reverberation. But physical explanations didn't account for why the two voices were semantically coherent yet distinct. It wasn't syllables echoing, it was meaning overlapping. Trying a technical check, I left my phone recording for an entire afternoon. I placed it in the center of the room and let it run while I simulated conversations with my mother. When I listened back, the audio was clean and linear, no ghost duplications. That made me more confused. The human ear had caught something the microphone hadn't. I asked my parents again if anyone might have spoken twice or in an odd way. They insisted they hadn't. Nina, who always reacted to tonal changes, seemed indifferent when I tried to recreate the scene. I called her with a similar tone, but didn't see the surprised reaction I'd seen before. A dog isn't a witness to human elections, it responds to simple stimuli. I went to the library. I read about auditory hallucinations, pareidolia, the tendency to find patterns in noise, and sleep-related hypnagogic auditory experiences. All plausible, all with scientific labels. Still, when I close my eyes, the memory of that sound insists on existing in a way books can't erase. At night, I began avoiding being alone in the living room. When I forced myself to sit there, I examined the light, the tone of voices, the positions of things. It became a near childish vigilance, like someone guarding a fragile secret with tiny rituals. These routines didn't fix the rupture, they only added layers of suspicion to daily life. By the end of the second week, something changed. My mother called a friend and, after hearing me question the event, mentioned she herself had experienced strange lapses of memory years earlier, small failures, repeated words. It wasn't enough to explain everything, but it opened a new possibility. Perhaps it wasn't only the physical space. Maybe something in the routine could fold speech.
It happened 3 months later, and that's why it lodged in my mind as confirmation of a persistent anomaly. It was a night of fine rain. The windows had droplets aligning small points of streetlight. I was clearing papers from the table when I heard my mother in the other room mention something about old letters. The conversation began normally. They talked about correspondence, yellowed envelopes, and names that came from the past. I remembered afternoons when she liked to leaf through boxes of family letters, always carefully, like someone handling fine glass. Suddenly, in the middle of her account, I felt another voice, my stepfather's voice, whisper at my side. "Keep that. Don't throw it away." It was a short, intimate sentence telling me what no one had asked. The intonation was sweet, almost conspiratorial. The room filled with the impression of confidence. I rushed to the place I thought it had come from and found my mother holding an envelope, looking at the date with a gesture of nostalgia. I asked who had spoken. She raised her eyes and said she hadn't heard anything but the rain. My stepfather was on the balcony, smoking, and insisted it wasn't him. This time, the difference was in the mode. The first occurrence had been a noisy overlap. This one was a whisper at my ear, an instruction I hadn't requested. The feeling that the voices chose me when I was handling memories grew stronger. There was an obvious coincidence. Both events highlighted the link between present and past. In the first episode, it was the bar. In the second, letters that hold memories. It seemed the anomaly preferred points of temporal connection. I began jotting small notes: time, weather, what I was handling. I noticed tiny patterns. Both events happened during moments of scattered attention, me reading, me flipping through things, situations where the mind might drift. For a while, that gave me a sense of control. If I understood the conditions, maybe I could avoid new episodes. At home, I changed habits. I left doors ajar, turned on old radios to check for interference, played with recordings. Nothing reproduced the feeling of two voices barking in sync. The frustration grew. The scientific explanation felt within reach, and yet impossible to capture. I went to talk to an old neighbor, a man who had lived in the building for decades. He smiled when I talked about voices and mentioned noises the building kept, pipes that seemed to whisper names, cracks that created harmonic notes. His talk carried the authority, of someone who knows the territory and accepts that houses have their own sonic memories. Still, the experience didn't fit as a purely architectural phenomenon. It was personal. Each occurrence seemed directed at me, as if someone, the house itself, chance, wanted me to notice a seam between times. That increased the sense of exposure. It was unsettling to feel like an invisible audience was tethered to the walls. The third occurrence never came, and the absence of that repetition left a larger hole. There was confirmation, and at the same time, an end to the pattern. I lived on with the unanswered question, which settled like a stain on the fabric of daily life, discreet, but always perceptible.
Once I realized that something happened with low but recurring frequency, I decided to investigate in an amateurish way, not for science, but out of a ritual need, to turn fear into protocol. I bought a good recorder and placed it in different corners of the living room, testing angles. I recorded for weeks. I logged incidents since I began to see patterns where maybe none existed. When I reviewed the files, I found long stretches of silence and then some ordinary domestic noise, a pan, a bark, traffic. Nothing that justified overlapping voices. The clean audio didn't confirm what I had heard. Then I experimented with light. I found that the feeling of strangeness increased at dusk and on cloudy days. There was something about the quality of light that amplifies sensory relations. Shadows, finally, also seemed a clue. Old houses keep ways of turning lights on and off that confuse the eye. I introduced a small ritual. Before sitting in the living room, I would place the chair in a precise position, leave an empty cup on the right corner, and open the window 2 centimeters. These gestures had little real effect, but a lot of psychological effect. They gave me a sense of agency. Ritualizing is a human way of negotiating uncertainty. I spoke with a sound technician out of curiosity. He laughed politely and explained micro-reflections and phase interference, phenomena that, in certain environments, create strange auditory images. Yet he admitted it was uncommon for these to produce semantically coherent content, like whole words or sentences. I sought help from a mental health professional, not out of paranoia, but to check whether my perception might be distorted. The conversation was useful. He suggested sleep studies and auditory exams. I took the tests. Everything came back as expected. The clinician spoke about how we interpret signals and our tendency to construct narratives from noise. This mix of technical and psychological explanations left me ambiguous. Nothing wrong with my hearing, nothing obviously wrong with the building, and still I kept the sensation that someone had split the timeline in half. It was a gap science didn't fill as quickly as I wanted. To cope, I created a physical file, a folder with dates, transcriptions, and small notes about sensations. While leafing through it, I noticed an emerging aesthetic, a kind of intimate documentation that seemed to prepare, ritual-like, a case that might or might not be explained in the future. Some days later, I found an old note in a box written by my mother's grandmother that said, "Keep what belongs to you." I don't know if it was coincidence or confirmation bias, but reading that note gave me a shiver. The same short, enigmatic sentence I had heard whispered while holding the letters. That forced me to admit that my investigation was also a construction. I hunted patterns, made rituals, and gathered evidence. And in that stitching there was a danger, turning lived experience into a personal myth, where the house and its noises conspired around me.
Time, for small things like this, works irregularly. It passes and leaves invisible marks. Right after the episodes, I felt that my relationship with the house had changed. Familiarity had been scratched by doubt. Any noise could be a sign, any silence a secret. I began to observe daily gestures with the eyes of an investigator. How my mother filtered coffee, the order of books on the shelf, the sound of the key in the lock. Items that had been neutral gained semantic weight, as if, by looking more closely, I could detect loose threads in reality. Friends noticed a change in my mood. I had become more cautious in trivial conversations, perhaps because I wondered where speech might split. That subtly isolated me. The mere possibility of something unusual lowered me from curiosity to a place of constant vigilance. Sometimes, out of laziness or desperation, I pretended not to hear anything. I watched TV with the volume up and laughed at scenes that had once interested me. That strategy worked for a while, but it didn't fix what had settled in me, the sense of a punctual fault that was at once personal and impersonal. I became aware that human memory is a lens that distorts. Every time I told the story, every conversation I rechecked, the event changed shape, and the narrative I built about it was no longer neutral. There was, then, a performative element. Telling the story to others altered how I stored it. Over time, curiosity took on a calmer face. Instead of demanding a categorical truth, I began to accept that some ruptures remain unresolved. That didn't mean resignation. It meant choosing battles. Still, whenever I crossed the kitchen, the recollection tightened for a few seconds, like a knot. Certain old gestures kept coming back to unsettle me. My stepfather wiping his cup with his thumb. My mother closing the window against the wind. Nina growling at a distant noise. Those details functioned as anchors, reference points that helped me separate memory from invention. Eventually, I decided to turn the experience into writing. I put the story on paper, described each sound, each hesitation. While writing, I discovered that words have the power to organize chaos. The narrative gave shape to the confusion and, paradoxically, moved me slightly away from the initial panic. I received messages from people who read an excerpt and shared similar experiences. Voices in dreams that felt real, auditory lapses, déjà vu accompanied by sounds. That comforted me. It wasn't an isolated case of perceptual decline. There are human contexts where strangeness happens. Today, revisiting everything, I have more questions than certainties. The anomaly left a lasting mark. It didn't kill my tranquility, but it reshaped it. I learned to live with domestic uncertainties and to accept that some small, disturbing failures of reality may never have a definite explanation.
Since then, I've carried the memory like a folded piece of paper in my pocket, discreet, always there, ready to be opened when routine shows a crack. I don't know whether there was a technical, emotional explanation or something between the two. I only know the experience put me before a question that insists on not dissolving. Maybe the most interesting thing isn't finding a categorical answer, but watching how the episode changed my way of perceiving the ordinary. Small incidents reveal fissures in our certainties and show that the world, even in its most domestic routine, can house strangenesses that force us to look again. I ended the night of that first episode listening to the silence more carefully. If you've been through something similar, share in the comments where you're watching from, city and country, and what your hypothesis would be. If you liked the video, subscribe, like, and come back for more stories that turn everyday life into an enigma. See you next time.